In Chapter 136 of the original Yu-Gi-Oh! Manga, the world was introduced to a game unlike any that had been seen before. A game in which two participants would become monster lords, summoning creatures by rolling dice and creating the mystical dungeon in which they did battle, until, through a combination of luck and strategy, one player would claim victory over the other. This game was known as Dungeon Dice Monsters. And it was peak! In the introduction to my last video, I made a passing reference to seeing the physical version of the Dungeon Dice Monsters game at a Suncoast video store in my youth, and mentioned how I always wished that I could have collected more of the game before it ultimately went belly up like so many other periphery products of popular franchises tend to. And the reason that I brought it up is that at this point I probably spend more days out of any given year thinking about Dungeon Dice Monsters than days that I do not. I genuinely believe it is a shame that Dungeon Dice Monsters died as quickly as it did, because there was nothing like it at the time, and has since left me with a particular itch that not even
boom, tough actin' can
manage to soothe. For the link-summoning Zoomers among us who have never heard of Dungeon Dice Monsters, what is it? Well, it's a collectible miniature skirmish game set in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Universe, in which players do battle with figures and dice instead of cards and dice, but a different kind. Over the course of a game, players will summon monsters by rolling dice and unfolding those very same dice in order to build a path through a blank dungeon that their monsters can use to reach and attack the opposing monster lord 3 times in order to claim victory. The monsters a player has access to come in 4 different levels and can be summoned by rolling 2 summon crests of a matching level, with higher level summon crests appearing less frequently on any given die. When a player rolls double summon crests, as long as there is a valid space for them to place their unfolded die that also connects to their existing dungeon path, then they place the tiles and their newly summoned monster into the dungeon. From here, every action that a figure can take, whether that be movement, attacks, defense, or abilities, is controlled by crests that are required on the 3 dice rolled per turn. Now, what non-summon crests you roll are placed into a dice pool that persists between turns, so that even if you're rolling bad now, you have the potential for explosive turns later on once you roll the specific crest you need to get your plays going in the moment. And that's really about the basics of the game. Roll dice, summon monsters, build a dungeon path, and slay the enemy monster lord. It's simple, it's elegant, and it's fun, so why did it almost immediately faceplant? Well, one of many reasons I could give is that I'm not being 100% honest with you when I say that that's really about the basics of the game. You see, Dungeon Dice Monsters is not just one game. It's 3. 4 if you count the version found in the anime and manga, but we're talking about ones that you can explicitly play in real life. First is the Japanese version, second is the American version, and third is the version on the GBA. Yeah, no, this entire situation was a mess from the get-go. The easiest way to illustrate the disparity between the different versions of the game is to literally just list what's different about each one. So let's do exactly that, starting with the Japanese version. In the Japanese version of Dungeon Dice Monsters, you could buy random booster packs which contained a monster figure, a die, and a card that lists the monster's stats. From there, a player could construct their team, known in-game as their dice pool, with any combination of 15 dice and 10 figures, with the only restrictions being that a monster's type had to match the color of that die, and that a player could only include 3 dice in their dice pool, with level 4 summoning crests, level 4 monsters being the strongest ones in the game. Because summon crests are naturally balanced by how many times they appear on a given die, this meant that players were given near total freedom to build their team however they wanted to, while still maintaining a relative power balance. In theory anyways, but frankly that's a caveat you could add to the discussion of literally any customizable game ever. In addition to this, each die had a specific configuration that it could unfold into, meaning that even what options for dungeon building would be available to a player became a factor for consideration in dice pool building. I don't necessarily know that I would call this better or worse than the other versions, but it's definitely interesting and makes it distinctive. So now the question on everybody's mind, how does that compare to the version of the game that we got over here in Freedom Land? Well, in the American version of the game, there are no collectible custom dice in the booster packs, just 1 figure and 1 card. This is because, in the American version of the game, we do not let players build their own custom dice pool. Instead, the player is given 12 dice total, bearing summon crests of level 1 through 4 in sets of 3 dice each. Just like in the Japanese version, a player chooses any 3 of their dice to roll each turn, but if a player rolls doubles in this edition, they can choose any of their figures with a matching level to summon, as opposed to the Japanese version, in which the color of the die determines the type of monster it can be used to summon. Now, this is another change that can be seen as either good or bad depending on your personal taste. For me, having to think about what dice you include in your pool and what to roll each turn based on what you're hoping to summon makes the game feel more dynamic and interesting, But I can also see the argument that having access to any monster with a matching level gives more strategic moment-to-moment gameplay decision-making. And if you think that's going to be a weird pain point between editions, wait until you hear about the most egregious change. Well, to be fair, it is an interesting situation on paper, at least, appropriate use of wording. As mentioned before, the Japanese dice were made specifically to fold out in certain patterns, with different dice being able to unfold into different shapes. What this meant is that as players summoned monsters, their dice options became more limited, as did the shapes of dice they could unfold into the dungeon. But you'll recall that the US version did not use custom dice, instead giving players pools of 12 dice that did not unfold and had set patterns on them. So, what was the alternative solution they had when it came to the question of dungeon paths? Total freedom, as is the American way. Yes, in the American version, you have access to just about any 6-square configuration that the devs thought of when you dimension your die to summon a monster. Sounds great, right? Yeah, no, it totally is. By the way, did I mention that the dungeon tiles are these flimsy little laminated pieces of paper that you place on the paper playmat as the game goes on? Yeah, this is not ideal. While I do think that giving the players access to any configuration when summoning is more accurate to the game than Kazuki Takahashi had initially envisioned, and leads to more interesting and strategic gameplay, the implementation of this was flawed at best. But then again, the Japanese plastic unfolding dice didn't exactly lay perfectly flat every time either, from what I hear, so really it just comes down to what brand of frustration you're willing to deal with. Other than a few optional rules surrounding rerolls and triple summon crest bonuses, as well as a second game mode using a smaller dungeon for games with less figures, the heart of the experience is still the same no matter which edition you're playing. Roll dice, summon monsters, and build a path to pummel your opponent's monster lord. An elegant and cool system for a game that died an early death from lack of player base. Which is why for so many of us, the only way we can play this game nowadays without the use of Tabletop Simulator or a 3D printer is the third, slightly different version of the game, the one created for the Game Boy Advance. Yes, thankfully somebody at Konami had the good sense to remember how well weird Yu-Gi-Oh! Spin-off games were received when they weren't called Destiny Board Traveler, and thus Dungeon Dice Monsters for the Game Boy Advance was born. A game that was more or less completely bare bones, but was special nonetheless as being a really enjoyable way to play Dungeon Dice Monsters even if you had no friends. Or if you still have no friends at age 30 because you make YouTube videos about toys instead of going out and connecting with other human beings. So what's different in this version of the game? Well, it is closer to the Japanese version than the American one, with only a few minor tweaks. Instead of constructing a dice pool out of 15 dice and 10 figures, each die in the game is tied to a specific monster with a bespoke set of crests. This means that choosing which dice to construct your pool from becomes an even more tactical decision, as sometimes you may want to take an incredibly weak monster whose dice can give you up to 5 crests from a single roll. In addition to this, each dice when dimensioned can be laid out in any combination of form and rotation, giving players the ultimate level of tactical freedom as the game unfolds. Unfolds. Now, regardless of which system you think has the most tactical depth, I think this is easily the coolest one because it leads to moments like those in the anime where you can manage an impossibly tight dimension with the use of smart 3-dimensional thinking. In addition to that, another system that makes the GBA version of the game more unique is the type advantage system between monsters that I really wish they hadn't included because it's kind of a pain to deal with and isn't in those other editions. Also unique to this version of the game is the implementation of blowback damage from defense crests, like when you attack a monster with a higher defense stat in Yu-Gi-Oh! Not really the biggest fan of this either. But even with those two gripes, this is still an incredibly enjoyable version of the game that I am happy to have because I don't know how else I ever would have gotten to experience Dungeon Dice Monsters without making proxies or paying stupid amounts of money on eBay. I recommend going out and finding a copy of this game for yourself because it easily holds up to this day as a way to experience this quirky little spin-off that deserved so much better than it got. And that's the reason I wanted to talk about Dungeon Dice Monsters in the first place, and something I mentioned at the top of this video. That this game, regardless of how it was received back in the day, was important and still is important in a way that no other game since has managed to be, in my opinion. Because what it was is something that many games have tried and failed to be. It is a true entry-level wargame. Wargaming is an incredibly fun and rewarding hobby that I have been reconnecting with as of late, playing Kill Team with my Wednesday night gaming group at the LGS. One of the most unique types of games out there, wargames are so often one of the most multifaceted hobbies in existence, in which players can collect three-dimensional representations of characters that appeal to them, often constructing and then painting those figures themselves in order to create something truly one-of-a-kind and unique to each player. From there, the actual games associated with those figures give players an infinite venue not only to display the fruits of their creative endeavors, but gives them a practical use, pitting them in matched conflict against the figures created by other players who share a love of the same hobby. It is a truly incredible and one-of-a-kind genre of game, but it goes without saying that there's two major problems. The first of which is that these games can be a nightmare to learn, either having rules that feel very loose and freeform to TCG players used to having more concrete laws that dictate interactions, or being endlessly overcomplicated like the first two editions of D&D. The second problem is that they are prohibitively expensive. Anyone who spent more than a little bit of time at their local gaming store can tell you that miniatures games, from the skirmish-sized Marvel Crisis Protocol to the full-on army-sized warfare of Warhammer Age of Sigmar, are financial sinkholes, with boxes of units costing upwards of $50 and as much as $30 for individual heroes, to say nothing about vehicles and monsters. And that's not even beginning to add on the costs of codexes, the paints and brushes you'll need to even get started, and all of the other little costs that add up so quickly that you're going to find yourself taking out a loan just so you can play toy soldiers. And that's not even mentioning how much time it takes to paint, because even though I enjoy seeing what my models look like when I finally finish painting them, my executive dysfunction makes even pulling out the brushes and water just long enough to slap chop a few colors on feels like a Herculean effort at times. And all of that and more is why there is so often a need for a baby's first wargame. This is a niche that many games have tried to fill in the past, some with more affordable miniatures that are easy to paint and more streamlined rules, and while I do think that they have merit, none of them have felt as easily grab a starter set and get playing that same day as Dungeon Dice Monsters does. I think that the closest the world has gotten is HeroClix, but honestly I think a lot of HeroClix figures look even worse than Dungeon Dice Monsters, though I'll admit that's a tight race and probably just comes down to personal opinion. Where HeroClix tends to lose most new players, though, is that trying to learn how to play the game is like trying to read a car manual. It was legitimately exhausting trying to read through this when all my friends and I wanted to do was have Cyclops fight against Gypsy Danger. And don't even get me started on points. If you want to scare off a casual gamer, try showing them how cool your figures are and then explain to them how building a roster works. That is the beauty of Dungeon Dice Monsters. It is simple, it is clean, it is streamlined. No points, no messing with nippers and superglue, or dealing with the shame of your gray plastic being put up against your opponent's object source-lighted figures. Just two players picking their favorite pre-painted toys they got from random boosters and sitting down to play a game that takes less than 5 minutes to explain. I'm not saying it's better than full war and skirmish games, but it's an important option specifically for onboarding new players into this cool and exciting genre, and even as a lower investment game for those of us who do enjoy the real thing. I already mentioned that I love playing Kill Team, and I'm also in the process of finishing up my Scaventide Spearhead armies, but I'm not always going to want to commit to spending the next 2 to 3 hours of my life on a highly tactical war simulation. Sometimes I just want to roll a couple of dice and summon Blue Eyes White Dragon. And it's a shame that we don't have an option that allows for that in the same way that Dungeon Dice Monsters did. Because I feel like whoever can manage to crack that feeling has a potential gold mine in their hands. But it isn't easy. Hell, it's financial suicide for all but the biggest of companies. Frankly, for the independent game dev, you'd probably have to make it a video game. I should know, I've been trying for years to develop my own tabletop game that takes inspiration from Dungeon Dice Monsters and the lesser-known Capsule Monster chess game, and along the way I eventually realized that if this was going to be the kind of game that I wanted it to be, it was never going to see the light of day outside of my LGS. So to you, the theoretical millionaire game developer watching this video at this very moment, I beseech you, learn from the lessons of Dungeon Dice Monsters and bankroll a game that feels like it did. A simple, easy-to-learn, modular game with tactile, customizable gameplay and an emphasis on dice as the primary mechanic. I will play it, and I will force all of my friends to play it with me. And the rest of you, that is where we're going to leave things for now, so if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and a share. Powerfully Pointless is still a very small channel with a lot of room to grow, and every little bit helps. And hey, before you go, how about checking out another one of my videos? I recommend last week's video where I talk about how I regret not being able to buy Dungeon Dice Monsters back in the day, and try to figure out why shopping just doesn't feel as satisfying as it used to. And as always, just remember that this has been a powerfully pointless video, but I hope you enjoyed it anyways. And yes, I know about Grimpath.